rencontré Walter John Williams, qui a toujours apprécié les terres sous l'horizon, que ce dernier soit maritime ou virtuel. Consacré maître du cyberpunk aux côtés de William Gibson, Sterling, Pat Cadigan ou George Alec Effinger, avec une série de romans magistraux comme Câblé ou Le souffle du cyclone. Il a su en trouver toute la justification et le cheminement avant de s'en affranchir pour mieux explorer les arcanes des planètes opéra avec Plasma ou verser dans la novélisation autour de Star Wars. Avec les aventures de Dagmar, de Ceci n'est pas un jeu à Bowie and Gates, il a rejoint une nouvelle fois Gibson dans l'observation de l'ultramodernité. Pourriez-vous faire un léger retour sur la révolution cyberpunk et... Ok. Et parler ça.
For me, the cyberpunk was a result of my evolution as a writer. My first published cyberpunk novel was actually my 8th published novel, and I had been reaching in that direction for some time. Yes. In my case, I was also fairly isolated from the writers that were also identified as cyberpunk. I lived in New Mexico, which is a remote part of the United States. And I had never heard the word cyberpunk until after I wrote my novel Hardwired, Câblé, and my editor said, "You're going to be called a cyberpunk now." And I said, "Is that a good thing?" And I have still not got an answer for that.
Mais quel est l'apport du cyberpunk à la science-fiction, ne serait-ce que par ses archétypes? What does cyberpunk bring to science fiction, at least with its archetypes?
Okay, the cyberpunk arrived with a lot of energy, and the reactions were extreme. I recently read the reviews of Hardwired when it came out, and they were very polarized. Half were positive, and half were raving, drooling hatred. And I had begun, because I had published 7 previous novels, I had become used to the fact that I could continue to write books and they would be ignored and I could continue to write whatever I liked. And suddenly I had this huge passionate reaction. I had deliberately employed archetypes in that book. As I say, I live in New Mexico. We have real cowboys there. I knew this guy pretty well.
I come from Newtown.
There was a big shock at the appearance of cyberpunk, and so much of it coming out from so many different voices, all around the same time. And I'm not exactly sure why the reactions were so extreme even today. We were reacting against the previous generation's writers, but I think there had been punk in science fiction before. Norman Spinrad, Michael Moorcock, Samuel Delaney, who was a particular influence on me. I think we had seen that kind of energy before, and it was polarizing at the time. And currently we're seeing that kind of polarization and that kind of passion arriving from other issues. So.
Mais on pourrait parler aussi de l'évolution du cyberpunk vers le post-cyber. How about the evolution of cyberpunk to the post-cyber?
I think cyberpunk has not ended. Cyberpunk has evolved, as my own work has evolved. I think the two big lessons to take from Cyberpunk are firstly that the future will be multicultural. It will not be a single culture as we've seen in so much previous science fiction. And also that different elements of society will use the same technology in very, very different ways. And so as I've continued my journey as a writer, I think I've continued to embody that in whatever I've been working on. I don't think cyberpunk is just urban dystopia. I think it can be anything, but it has to be viewed through the cyberpunk lens, and there has to be a good deal of thought applied to it.
William Gibson a un jour dit que le futur était déjà là, mais qu'il n'était pas distribué de manière équitable.
That's absolutely true. Nor is it always equally distributed in publishing. I've discovered that a lot of my recent work has been held back simply because it was extreme for the time, and now has seemed now that it's almost contemporary fiction. I think one of the things that happened was that urban dystopia that people were writing about 30 years ago has much of it has come true. We were in revolt not against a far future, but against the future that we saw coming, and that this future, for the large part, has appeared. Sorry, we tried to warn you.
D'une certaine manière, vous êtes la main gauche du prophète. Quand on voit vos titres d'ultra contemporains descendants du cyberpunk, Dagmar dans Ceci n'est pas un jeu, vraiment penser à Case dans l'identification des schémas, par exemple de Gibson. Really a descendant of cyberpunk. Good Dagmar is very similar to the pacing of Gibson, kind of the left end of the prophet.
I think left hand of the prophet is a wonderful description. I don't know how well it applies to me, but I'm happy to accept it. The Dagmar stories had in origin when I was employed to write a game, an online game, an alternate reality game. And a function of alternate reality games is that they don't just take place online. If you join an ordinary online game, you join, you log on, you adventure by yourself or with your friends, and then you log off, turn off the computer, and go about your ordinary life. And that doesn't happen with an alternate reality game. With an alternate reality game, you start getting phone calls from fictional characters. You get email. You are sent out into the real world to accomplish missions. And I thought this blending of cyberculture with reality was very much worth writing about. After all, if you get a phone call purporting to be from a fictional character, you don't actually know who is on the other end of this line. If you get instructions from a perfect stranger, you don't necessarily know who's giving you those instructions and for what purpose. And so my book, This Is Not a Game, was intended to exploit that ambiguity in the relationship between the game and the player and the technology.
Il s'agit à ce moment-là d'une prospective technologique, de la réalité virtuelle du cyberpunk à la réalité alternative. So we're talking about technological perspective. Mm-hmm. We're coming from virtual reality to alternate reality.
Mm-hmm. I think the primary distinction is that with alternate reality, there is an element that takes place in reality. outside of any virtual element, outside of the computer, outside of any created world. And that's what I found interesting. If you are, for instance, if you're a player, you're presented with problems, with puzzles. You can't solve all of them on your own. So you have to unite with other players in ad hoc groups that have the knowledge to solve this. In the game that I designed, last call poker, I didn't design it, I wrote it, but there was an element that was ciphered 3 ways. Firstly, it was in German. Secondly, it was ciphered with an actual military cipher called Playfair. And third, it was sent in Morse code. So in order to get the message, you had to find someone who knew Morse, be able to decode this very technical cipher, and then find some way to read the German message. And it took the players 2 hours to do all of that.
Short.
And from the beginning that the message was loaded online. And I realized that what is happening here is that alternate reality games teach people how to break codes, how to perform missions in reality, how to get information from complete strangers, and that these are espionage skills, and that they could be used by an intelligence service or somebody working against an intelligence service to fulfill their own objectives while still maintaining the appearance of a game. And so that was the second of the Dagmar books, which was Deep State, in which I wrote about the Arab Spring, except that I wrote about the Arab Spring before the Arab Spring happened. And the book appeared in the States the same week that the Egyptians occupied Tahrir Square. So it was science fiction when I wrote it. It has now become an alternate history.
Exactly like there's a book from Norman Spinrad.
Yes.
That became a dystopia as soon as it was published.
Yeah. Yes, it's. I know a number of those books that. The publishing had bad timing where the end of the Cold War was concerned. That particular Norman Spinrad novel, I can't recall the title, but it was a really terrific novel. But unfortunately, it took place in a Cold War environment.
Russian Spring.
Russian Spring, okay. And events turned it into alternate history very quickly. Actually, if you go back and look at Gibson's Neuromancer series, that takes place in a war, in a future in which the Cold War still exists. So that was a piece of the future that very few people got right. I'm pleased to report I was one of them.
The first to do that. Nous reparlons du jeu. Le jeu est quelque chose de très important pour vous. C'est un moteur de création. Vous avez créé des jeux vous-même. Vous avez écrit à partir des jeux. Quelle est votre relation au ludique? You created games, you wrote about games. Mm-hmm. What is your relationships to games as about the total creation of it? Mm-hmm. How
yeah. I've always been a gamer from a very early age. I've always, throughout my adult life, had a very active gaming life. If my life had turned out differently, I might have become a game writer full-time and a science fiction writer as a hobby.
Mais vous avez créé des jeux.
Yes, I've created a number of them. Very few of them have been published because there was, at the time, there was very little profit in these sorts of games, and it would have. But in any case, At one time, I was in a gaming group. We did role-playing that involved George R.R. Martin and Roger Zelazny and Melinda Snodgrass and Victor Milan. And these were some very high-powered creative minds working in this milieu. And unfortunately, everything that was created in there was very ephemeral. But watching Roger and George and all these other wildly creative people doing elaborate improvisatory theater was really wonderful. I wish you could have all seen it.
Est-ce qu'à ce moment-là, le jeu de rôle est devenu une force créatrice pour vous? The role-playing game became a creative force for you.
I tended to create games that were based on books that I would never write about. So I had a pretty good idea that I would never write mystery novels. So I created a game for my friends in which they played detectives and solved mysteries that I created. I had a pretty good idea I would never write a series of books about the late Roman Republic, although it's an area that I'm very interested in. So I created a game that ran for many years, set in the late Roman Republic. I have not created any science fiction games. I think because that's my job, and when I game, I want to get away from my job.
Mais en tant qu'auteur de Cyberpunk, la dimension politique et stratégique de vos œuvres est extrêmement importante. As a writer, as a Cyberpunk writer, politic and strategic side of your work is very important.
Yeah. Okay, I'm not sure what the question is.
Are you a political writer in what you do?
Yes.
It seems from a French point of view.
Yeah. I write about politics. I write from a political perspective. I don't think I'm a particularly ideological writer. I write about those political elements that interest me or that seem applicable to the particular work. I have political ideas. They are doubtless expressed in the works. It's not something I deliberately intend to do. I think the dystopias, warning about I didn't intend to exactly warn anyone about this future, but I was afraid it was going to happen. One of the big influences on Cyberpunk was the election of Ronald Reagan, and the reaction in the creative community to that event. I think that the world that I wrote about in Hardwired was perhaps not Ronald Reagan's fantasy, but it was a fantasy of the people around him.
Mais il y a une dimension politique, par exemple, dans la série de Ceci n'est pas un jeu, les aventures de Dagmar sont éminemment politiques. Dagmar's adventures from This Is Not a Game to the Bullion Gates are very political.
The Bullion Gate or the Deep State or
Deep State. This is not a game.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
C'est une question de révolution et de résistance.
It's a question of revolution and resistance. Yeah. I realized that there was an opportunity with the evolving technology to attempt to change the world. That it was possible to establish a virtual government and to have this government replace the real government. An example of a virtual government would be Al-Qaeda. They have a command force, they have an army, they do taxation, they have welfare. What they don't have is territory that they claim or permanent borders that they claim. But if you set up a virtual government like that, you can theoretically leech the power from the actual government in your area. And so Deep State was written specifically to address that issue. It was set in Turkey because I'm familiar with Turkey and some of the situation that obtained there 5-10 years ago. But yes, Deep State is a handbook for how to do this sort of thing. Because governments have developed counter responses to all of these tactics now, it is probably a little less likely that you can do a successful tweet revolution or whatever than you could. But once again, I think it is possible to just bypass all those elements that are trying to stop you.
Le cyberpunk a aussi une relation particulière avec la singularité. Est-ce vraiment une issue inévitable?
Cyberpunk has a very close relationship with singularity.
Do you think it's the
Inevitable issue. Cyberpunk.
Will lead to singularity. Yeah. Well, I think Cyberpunk is exploring all of the various alternatives for artificial intelligence. Beginning with Neuromancer, which was a book about an artificial intelligence that was trying to liberate itself. I tended to avoid that kind of topic, in part because other writers were already dealing with it, but also because I'm a bit of a skeptic when you're dealing with what they call hard artificial intelligence.
The voice of the whirlwind was very close to singularity. La voix du cyclone était beaucoup plus proche de la singularité avec l'existence d'un clone qui ne possédait la mémoire de son alpha que jusqu'à ses 25 ans.
Yeah. Well, yes. Well, that's one of the one element of human existence is death, and so I am always trying to figure out a way to avoid all that. And so cloning with the transfer of intelligence struck me as useful. Also, it's actually a bit cultish, but there is a group of people who are very dedicated to uploading their own personalities into computers so that they can live forever. My question is whether living in a computer is worth living, but that's sort of a matter of belief, and I'm actually on 4 entire roundtables at this convention about artificial intelligence. So perhaps we can defer these issues until later in the weekend.
Oh non, ce n'est pas une question d'intelligence artificielle, c'est une question de singularité, de transfert de personnalité dans un être humain.
We're not talking about artificial intelligence, but transfer of human mind to a clone.
Yes, but the human mind is actually downloaded, or rather uploaded into a machine, then downloaded into the clone in my story. And simply because my story wasn't about this, I didn't deal particularly with the potential for abuse in that, because if you have the potential to download a personality into a clone, it does not necessarily have to be the personality that started in that body. It could be a personality that you have defined for a particular reason and for a particular purpose. I think in Star Wars, the clones in the Clone Wars are obviously an element of that. They're all the same person. They're all faceless. They're all dangerous, and they are in service to a totalitarian regime.
Il y a beaucoup de votre travail qui tourne autour de la connexion. qui va au-delà de soi, qui parfois même va jusqu'à faire un avec la machine.
Work a lot about connection that goes way ahead of the self and comes to being with the machine.
Okay, I'm trying to think of a story in which I dealt with that. Yes. We have an information sphere now, and we have machines that are developed to exploit that information sphere. We have a very expensive computer developed by IBM that is built to play an American game show called Jeopardy. I don't know if you have it here, but they were, but it was the champion. It beat all of the other Jeopardy champions. But it's not a personality. It's just a program. So essentially, it was just very efficient at doing what any of us with an internet connection can do. We can access that information and we can process it. It wasn't, they didn't have access to any information that all of us don't have. So it is possible to extend your personality into the virtual world. You can find information. You can look through cameras all over the world to find out what's going on there. You can communicate with people all over the world. It doesn't alter your physical makeup or your biology in any way. So that's the information sphere. You can become connected to the information in various different ways, some of which have not yet been invented. I think what a lot of the issues are to what degree can the personality and the intelligence of a human being be augmented by the use of artificial intelligence or similar means. There's an active question as to how far you can do this while still remaining a human being. Other writers have explored this to a greater degree than I have. I did write a story called Incarnation Day, in which children are raised in a virtual environment because resources are rather scarce, and children are not productive economic units until they get older. So the children are raised by their parents in a virtual environment and then incarnated into bodies when they achieve a degree of maturity, knowledge, and can contribute to the economy.
Mais à ce moment-là, que pensez-vous du travail de Paolo Bacigalupi avec la fille automate?
So what do you think of Paolo Bacigalupi's work with the wind-up girl, with the creation of artificial beings which are totally organic?
Yeah. Well, if you create an artificial being, and this goes back to Mary Shelley, you're creating it for your purposes. So, and as Dr. Frankenstein discovered in that novel, the creation, the purposes of the creation were different from his own, and that led to all the conflict in that book. So if you create an artificial person, and it certainly seems possible at this point, you have to be prepared for it to be essentially your child. It may be an obedient child, it may be a rebellious child, and then what do you do? What do you do if your artificial child goes wrong? Is it then a person or is it just something that you can erase and start over? That was the issue that I explored in that particular story, Incarnation Day.
Mais pour en continuer avec la différence, vous avez fait le choix régulièrement de personnages féminins extrêmement forts, dont les failles complexifient la personnalité.
You've created very strong female characters whose weaknesses complexify the personality.
Yeah.
Being Sara in the Cote in hard water, going down
Yeah.
why that?
Yes. Okay. Well, as Chairman Mao said, women hold up half the sky. So I try to write about either the present that exists now or the future that I can see coming. And so, I deliberately include female characters who are strong, who are coping with their environment, who have ideas, because that's what I see around me. I have a lot of very smart, driven women friends, and I see no reason why these people shouldn't be reflected in my fiction as well as their own. Once again, I'm not particularly ideological on this regard. I am just writing about what I see. If the characters have weaknesses, it does, as you say, make them complex, but it also makes them human. That I don't find Superman or Superwoman to be a particularly interesting character. So my characters are very human, and they do make mistakes, and they do misjudge situations. And I think that that's certainly what makes them interesting to me, and I hope it makes them interesting to the reader as well.
Il y a aussi une importance assez importante dans vos textes à propos du décor et des costumes et des particularités.
You make great deal of importance with the settings, the costumes, the specification of the human body and the characters.
Yes. I describe the physical environment in great detail, particularly as it is different from our own physical environment. If I described this room in a novel, it would probably not take up quite so many words, because we all sort of know what this kind of room looks like. But if I were to describe the great hall of Emperor Darius at Persepolis, then in order to bring in the appropriate atmosphere, then it does require a good deal more description. And so I deliberately try to be very visual in my writing, because the visual clues tell you something about the world that I'm writing about, but they also tell you something about the perceptions of the person that I'm writing about, as to what they will notice and what they won't, and that contributes to their personality.
Le zen est aussi très important dans votre travail, que ce soit le zen de la machine, le zen de la guerre, avec quelque part une référence à Musashi.
Zen has very much importance in your work. The Zen of the machine, also the Zen of the warrior,
Yes.
with Musashi very much in the center of warrior classes.
Right. I am a martial artist. I'm a black belt in Kenpo karate, and so I think if you study Eastern martial arts to any degree, you become indoctrinated into Buddhism and Taoism and Zen, whether that is a deliberate part of the teaching or not. I think it's something that you are exposed to. And when I wrote Voice of the Whirlwind, which has a lot of Zen ideas in it, I was at a particular stage in my training. Yeah. And so I was trying to work out a way of someone who was applying philosophy directly in a dangerous environment as a way of maintaining his own humanity. If that's he didn't just want to be a mindless killer. He wanted to be acting in consistently with some ethic and within ethical behavior. He didn't succeed all the time, but as it turned out, there were factors that he wasn't aware of. But yeah, that's a part of my background, and so it ends up in the work as well, I think.
Language is also a part of your background. Working with language, playing with language. Donc le langage fait aussi partie de son travail, et de travailler avec le langage, de jouer avec le langage.
Well, that is the language is the ocean that a writer is swimming in. So I try to make my language as rich and complex as I hope the future will be. I use every tool that I have available to me, and that's my principal tool.
Et puis il y a les enfants du cyberpunk, des gens comme Richard Morgan avec Takeshi Kovacs et son Blackman, ou John Scalzi avec Le vieil homme et la mer. Comment voyez-vous ces auteurs qui sont issus de votre imagination?
There are children of Cyberpunk like Richard Morgan and John Scalzi with Takeshi Kovacs and Blackman for Morgan, or the old one in the sea and the wars with Scalzi. How do you feel towards these younger writers writing on your own backyard?
Well, I think that's terrific that I and some of the other writers have left a legacy. I was strongly influenced by the 60s wave, again, by Norman Spinrad and Roger Zelazny and Samuel Delaney and so on.
Norman Spinrad is the legacy of every real science fiction writer, I think.
I think you're right. And so, if I've contributed to the development of other writers, that's something that I'm very proud of. And of course, I also teach writing, and I'm very proud of how those guys have turned out.
Nous arrivons à la fin de cette table ronde, donc il serait temps de vous donner la parole à vous, le public. Donc si quelqu'un a une question, qu'il lève la main, voilà.
Ah, okay.
Good evening, Mr. Williams. I'm very enjoyed to meet you because I do appreciate your work from the first time, because we are probably of the same generation. I would like to ask you two short questions. The first, but you have partially answered, is do you think that in the center of the thing, clone is still a novel that you can rewrite today?
Talking about the voice of a woman.
Okay. Yes. I'm sorry. What was the?
Still actual today. Still.
Do you always like this novel?
Yes, it's one of my favorites.
Yes, it's my favorite too.
Yeah, in part because I was able to pull off something in the plot that I'd never done before, which is that in the last 5 chapters, you find out that everything in the previous chapters was untrue.
Yes.
So then in the last but 5 chapters, you found out everything, and then in the chapter after that, you found out that chapter was untrue, and then so on. I have to pat myself on the back for being ingenious for that one. But yeah, that is one of my favorite books, and I had a wonderful time writing it, which isn't always the case. Was there another question?
Yes, it's probably a more difficult question, but I think you can answer it because you have talking about Buddhism.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I would like to suggest you that imagine, do you know you don't ignore that in the Buddhism there
you're not holding the microphone quite to your mouth, so I can't quite hear you.
Plus près. Just on, like that? Okay.
Voilà.
You don't ignore that in the Buddhism, if something is remaining, it is called agrega. Do you,
Buddhism.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the question.
Neither.
Okay.
Yeah, so
I'm going to have to ask
remaining.
you to repeat again. I'm sorry. There's too much noise in the background here.
okay, in the Buddhism, it is said that after the death, maybe something remain. In French, it is agrega. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's esoteric Buddhism.
You follow me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I can suggest you a future novel. Imagine the tragedy if you transfer something in a machine. It is not the person, but the aggregate.
Yeah, that's...
You have to read Paolo Bacigalupi's A Handful of Dharma in the Pump 6 short story collections. He talks about that.
I was about to say that's a great idea for a story, and you should write it. That's...
In the
Une autre question?
Oui, oui.
Une autre question?
Oui, une autre question. What do you think is the future of cyberpunk? Is there even such a future?
I think cyberpunk has become so much a part of science fiction now that it's sort of infiltrated all other subgenres. You know, there's punk fantasy. I mean, some of it's successful, some of it is not successful. But I think it will be with science fiction as long as there is science fiction.
It's the contemporary and future of science fiction, I think.
Another question? Oh, here, please.
We've talked a lot of cyberpunk, but you've wrote a lot of other books in different.
Plus près.
Oui, sorry. Vous avez écrit d'autres livres dans des genres bien différents de cyberpunk, en particulier le space opera. Est-ce que vous envisagez de refaire quelque chose dans la série Praxis, par exemple, ou d'autres space op, pas forcément cet univers?
in this same
I think the cyberpunk is a part of my makeup as a writer. And so I think no matter what I'm writing, I think there are cyberpunk elements to it. Because I'm, you know, ambitious and well-traveled and educated, I don't like to stay confined to any one subject for too long. I continue to try to write about all of the things that interest me. So, and so I have written space opera. I have written what S.M. Stirling called Sword and Singularity, which was implied spaces, which started as a fantasy. And only gradually, as the story developed, did you discover that it had been science fiction all along. But I think that I'm continuing to explore new worlds with my tools, and my tools include cyberpunk. So I don't think that's going away anytime soon.
It also includes piracy. Il y a aussi des pirates.
Well, they're just so much fun.
Une autre question?
I think we've stunned them into silence.
I guess so.
One more.
I am sorry to.
Il y a aussi une dimension
I only want to ask you.
révolutionnaire.
I only want to ask you if you have been contacted by movies réalisateurs to
Yes,
adapt?
I have sold options, which are in which I sell the right to pay me to make a movie. Okay, they're not paying me to make the movie. They are paying me for the right at some point in the future to possibly make the movie, to give me more money for the movie, right? So, because that's how Hollywood works. But yeah, all of the films have not worked out for one reason or another. I have an agent in Hollywood that is always pitching my work. And right now, in fact, there's a much better chance of seeing some of my work on the screen, either cinema or television, because now there are so many television networks, and they all need new content. And many of them are no longer afraid of science fiction. Science fiction has been shown to be enough of a draw to bring in an audience. So.
Mais il y a aussi une dimension évolutionnaire, voire révolutionnaire, et de résistance dans votre œuvre. There's also an revolutionary, and resistance in most of your writing.
Yeah. Well, I write usually from one of two perspectives. I write from the perspective of a person who has power and exercises power, and that would be, for example, Aristoi. Okay, and I write from the perspective of people who have no power and are trying to get in for instance, Hardwired. The people in Hardwired are trying, in the first place, to get enough power so that they can just be left alone. But yes, it does involve ultimately resistance and revolution. Well, there you go.
Mais vous allez jusqu'à la manipulation psychologique, génétique, mentale pour ça. You go towards genetic, mental, and psychological manipulations toward that.
Yes. Yes, that strongly depends on who's doing the manipulating. There are people who would, I'm sure, if they created artificial beings, these beings would be perfect, disciplined workers who would never ask for payment for overtime or very good food or very decent living conditions. On the other hand, I would like to create an artificial person so that I could concentrate on writing books and not have to deal with the rest of it. I think if it's totalitarian states or corporations that are creating the artificial people, then that's serious, and we need a revolution right away. On the other hand, if it's just me that's doing it for my own personal convenience, I think it's totally admirable.
Yeah, read Pachigolupi. Merci à tous, nous sommes arrivés à la fin du temps qui nous était imparti pour cette conférence. Merci à Walter John Williams pour ses réponses. Merci à vous pour vos questions.